Greetings, traveler of hours. I am the Watcher. Before we drift into the past, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I read every note before I rest. I have seen the rivers of time flow unbroken, and I have walked upon their shores, where the ages rise and fall like waves. Tonight, if you will linger by my side, I will guide you through one of the greatest dreams ever dreamed by humankind, the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. Let the world around you grow quiet. Let the burdens of the day slip into shadow. Beyond the veil of your waking thoughts lies the slow pulse of the Nile, carrying us into a land of stone, of gods, of kings who sought eternity. If my voice brings you comfort, you may choose to follow me and drift beside me through the ages. Together, we will walk the banks of Egypt's river, from its first dawn of villages and prayers to its golden empire, and at last to its long twilight beneath the desert stars. Come now, traveler. The Nile awaits. The Nile does not rush. It glides. From the highlands far to the south, it gathers streams, carries the scent of distant rains, and moves steadily northward until it pours into the sea. For those who first settled by its banks, the Nile was not merely water. It was a god, a living presence that kept them alive. In the long days of summer, when the air shimmered with heat and the desert cracked beneath the sun, they waited for the flood. The river would rise, spilling over its edges, leaving behind a dark gift, rich silt, black as night, fertile beyond measure. Each year, like the breath of a sleeping giant, the flood returned, and each year the people whispered thanks to the unseen power that brought it. The early villagers shaped their homes from mud and reeds, walls soft to the touch, roofs bound with palm fronds. Children splashed in the shallow pools left by retreating waters, while elders watched the river's flow with reverence. They believed that the Nile spoke, not with words but with signs. The patterns of birds circling above, the movement of fish in the shallows, the height of water on the stone markers. At dusk, as the sun dipped low, its reflection stretching in golden fire across the water, they would sit in silence. The Nile shimmered, the reeds whispered, and the air smelled of damp earth and sweet lotus. It was life, it was order, it was promise, and in its rhythm lay the foundation of everything to come. In the quiet dawn of Egypt's beginning, long before the first king placed a crown upon his brow, the people turned their eyes to stone. They saw in the mountains and cliffs faces of gods, stern and eternal. They gathered pebbles from the riverbank and placed them carefully upon the earth, small cairns to honor spirits unseen. These first shrines were humble, no greater than a child's playthings. Yet within them stirred the first breath of eternity. When they buried their dead, they laid them gently in shallow pits, curling the body like a sleeping child, facing westward, toward the place where the sun died each night. Around them they scattered beads of shell, carved ivory, and painted pots. These were not mere ornaments, but whispers of belief, that the soul would rise again, as the sun rose each morning. The wind blew softly across the desert plain, and the cliffs looked on in silence. To later ages, these crude offerings might seem fragile, easily lost to sand. Yet to those first Egyptians, each bead, each vessel carried immeasurable weight. They were keys to the unseen, gifts to persuade the gods to remember their names. By firelight, elders told stories of a great serpent who slithered through the dark waters before creation, of a radiant falcon who pierced the void with his cry, of the earth itself as a goddess who cradled them in her body. These were the first hymns of Egypt, whispered against the night, carried on the breath of stone. Even now, if one stands in the desert silence, where the stars blaze like uncountable lamps, one might almost hear them still, the soft murmur of prayers, the faint rustle of linen, the crackle of fire, and the endless patience of stone listening to the hopes of mortals. At first, Egypt's villages clung close to the river like children to a mother's robe. Their houses were pressed from Nile mud, baked firm in the sun, soft to the hand yet strong enough to hold families through seasons of flood and drought. The air inside such homes was cool, thick with the scent of clay and grain. Chickens clucked in the courtyards. Goats bleated softly in the evening shade. But within the hearts of these river folk stirred a longing for permanence. Clay crumbled, reeds withered, but stone endured. Slowly, their eyes turned from the riverbanks to the cliffs beyond. The first monuments were simple, low mounds raised for the dead, mud brick tombs called mastabas. Their shape echoed the flat horizon, as though the earth itself had been coaxed upward to cradle those who slept within. Inside, walls were smoothed with plaster, then painted with images of cattle, birds, and boats. Scenes of life meant to accompany the departed on their long voyage through eternity. In time, the builders grew bolder. Columns rose, carved not yet from marble but still from bundled reeds, immortalized in stone. Temples began to appear, their entrances facing east to greet the sun. Priests lit incense that drifted into the sky, carrying with it prayers woven from human breath. The air was heavy with frankincense and myrrh, the resinous perfume clinging to the garments of those who tended the sacred spaces. Imagine the sound of chisels striking limestone, echoing against the cliffs. Each mark was a prayer, each carving an act of devotion. The workers sang softly as they labored, voices rising in rhythm with their tools. They were not yet building pyramids, but something had begun. A new dialogue between humanity and eternity, between fragile flesh and enduring stone. At dusk, when the day's labor ended, the unfinished walls glowed gold in the fading light. Villagers would gather nearby, staring at the rising structures with awe. No longer were they only people of mud and reeds. They had begun to fashion monuments, not merely shelters from the wind, but anchors for memory, stairways for the soul. And so Egypt's true character awoke, a civilization of builders, dreamers, and seekers of eternity. Night in the early villages was deep and absolute. The desert sky was not scattered with a few timid lights, but ablaze with countless stars, so bright they seemed to lean close to earth. Around the hearth, families gathered, their faces gilded by fire, their voices hushed with reverence. It was in such hours that the gods awoke. The first was Ra, the radiant sun, born each dawn from the eastern horizon and sailing across the sky in his golden bark. They told of how he descended each evening into the underworld, fending off the great serpent of chaos that sought to swallow the light. Each sunrise was not a certainty, but a triumph, proof that the balance of the world had been preserved for another day. Beside him stood Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the fertile earth and the realm of the dead. They believed he had once walked the land as a just king, teaching humankind how to sow grain, how to measure the flood, how to live in harmony with Ma'at, the sacred order. Betrayed and slain by his brother Set, Osiris was pieced together again by his grieving wife, Isis, who became a goddess of love and magic. From her tears, it was said, the Nile swelled each year, bringing life back to the fields. Their son Horus, the falcon, rose to avenge his father, his sharp eyes forever watching from the sky. Every pharaoh to come would claim to be his living embodiment, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt as Horus wore the heavens. And there was Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls, who lingered in the silence of cemeteries, watching over the resting places of mortals. His was the hand that weighed the heart of the dead against the feather of Ma'at, deciding whether one would walk in the fields of reeds, or be devoured by silence. To the villagers, these tales were not mere stories. They were truths woven into the fabric of daily life. The rustle of papyrus in the breeze was the whisper of Thoth, lord of wisdom. The hiss of a cobra was Wadjet, protector of the pharaoh's brow. Even the mew of a cat in the night carried divine weight, for Batet kept watch in every household. The air was thick with myth. Every sunrise, every flood, every harvest was proof of the gods' nearness. In their prayers, the people gave thanks not for wealth or conquest, but for balance, the sacred harmony between water and desert, order and chaos, life and death. Thus, Egypt's pantheon was not born in marble halls or carved statues, but in the soft breath of stories told under a million stars. From these whispers came temples, rituals, hymns, and a vision of the cosmos so vast that even millennia could not silence it. The Nile is a twin river, split in spirit as much as in form. To the south stretched Upper Egypt, narrow and winding between cliffs, its waters swift and deep. To the north lay Lower Egypt, the broad delta where the river fanned into many mouths, a maze of green veins spilling into the sea. For countless generations, these two lands were rivals, separate, proud, their people bound to their own gods, their own kings. The crowns they wore were symbols of division. The white crown of the south, tall and slender like a flame, and the red crown of the north, flat-topped and curling at the back like a coiled serpent. But in time there came a man who dreamed of unity. His name was Narmer. Some called him Menes, others spoke of him as half-legend, half-king. What is remembered is not his battles, though surely there were many, but the vision he left carved into stone. The Narmer palette, a slab of green slate etched with images of power and union. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy with divine strength. On the other, he wears the red crown of the Delta, marching in triumph as his standard-bearers walk before him. Between the two images lies a message greater than conquest. The two lands are one. With this union came the birth of the double crown, the skent, a blending of red and white, of north and south, of papyrus and lotus twined together. From that moment, the pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god whose body was the land itself. His duty was to uphold Ma'at, the delicate order that bound the universe. Imagine the procession. Narmer striding through his capital, banners of falcons fluttering, priests chanting hymns older than memory. The people lining the riverbanks watched with wonder as he carried both crowns upon his head. For the first time, Egypt was whole, one breath, one pulse, one dream. In this unity lay the seed of eternity. For without it, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, no golden age to come. The land had been bound together like two reeds braided into a single cord, strong enough to withstand the weight of centuries. As dusk fell over the river that night, the villagers lit their fires and spoke of the day they had seen a god walk among them. Narmer's dream had become Egypt's destiny. Long before paper, before ink scratched across scrolls, Egypt found a way to bind memory. At first it was simple. Pictures carved upon pottery, small marks incised into ivory tags tied to jars of grain or oil. These were not yet words, but seeds of writing, hints of a language taking shape. From these marks grew the wonder of hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, as later ages would call them. Each symbol was alive with meaning. The falcon of Horus soaring in divine authority, the reed leaf whispering the sound of breath, the coiled cobra hissing the syllable of a name. To inscribe a word was not only to record it, it was to summon its spirit, to give it permanence. The most famous of these early images was the Narmer palette, a ceremonial slab of green siltstone. Upon it, artisans carved the unification of the two lands, Narmer wearing first one crown, then the other, striking down foes beneath the gaze of falcons and divine standards. To modern eyes it may seem only an artifact, but to those who beheld it, it was more than art. It was magic, a binding of reality into symbol. Imagine the hands that carved it, steady, patient, guided by ritual. The air filled with the tap of chisels, the dust of stone catching the light like powdered gold. Each stroke was a prayer, each line a thread woven into the fabric of eternity. As hieroglyphs spread, so too did the power of the scribe. In a land where few could read the god's language, scribes became keepers of memory, guardians of truth. With reed pens dipped in soot and ochre, they painted symbols onto smooth sheets of papyrus, thin, pale, and flexible, cut from the reeds of the Nile. The rustle of the papyrus scroll was the sound of a civilization giving voice to itself. Through these carvings and scrolls, Egypt's story ceased to vanish with the passing of generations. A decree could now outlive the man who spoke it. A prayer could echo centuries after lips had turned to dust. A king's triumph, a harvest tally, a hymn to the gods. All were fixed in the silence of symbol, enduring long after the cries of the living had faded. Thus was born the Egyptian conviction that nothing truly perished, so long as it was written. To inscribe a name was to preserve a soul, To carve a figure upon a temple wall was to ensure that its presence would never be erased from time. The palette of power and the writing it heralded was not merely history, it was immortality in stone. The Nile, when it receded after its yearly flood, left behind more than dark silt. It left life itself. Black earth, rich and moist, spread like a ribbon through the desert. Here the villagers bent to their work, coaxing from the soil the grain that would sustain both kings and commoners. The air was thick with the scent of earth and straw. Men guided wooden plows pulled by oxen, their shouts rising with the cries of ibises overhead. Women carried baskets heavy with reeds, melons, and barley, their linen dresses clinging lightly in the heat. Children ran barefoot along the banks, chasing frogs and dragonflies that shimmered like jewels in the morning light. At dawn, the fields were alive with motion. Farmers sowed seed in furrows softened by the flood. They raised their hands skyward in thanks to Osiris, the green lord of the land, and to Happy, spirit of the river, who swelled the banks each year. The rhythm of the seasons was not measured by months, but by the flood, the planting, the harvest. Bread was the heart of their diet, coarse loaves baked in clay ovens, their crusts hard but their interiors fragrant and warm. The smell of baking bread drifted through the villages, mingling with the sweet tang of beer brewing in clay jars. This beer was not strong but nourishing, thick with grain, drunk by laborers and lords alike. Houses were simple walls of sun-baked mud, whitewashed to reflect the heat. Inside, mats of woven rushes covered the floor, and low stools and reed baskets held the tools of daily life. Roofs were flat, serving as extra space where families slept beneath the stars in the cool of night. Animals lived close to their owners. Goats bleated in pens, donkeys brayed, cats purred softly in the shade. Their sleek forms both companions and guardians against rats that threatened the precious stores of grain. Dogs padded at their master's heels, loyal guardians of the home. The air was alive with sound, the soft trickle of irrigation canals, the laughter of children splashing in the shallows, the faint chant of workers as they carried water in jars. At sunset, the fields glowed gold, and families gathered outside their homes. They told stories as the stars appeared, simple tales of falcons, serpents, and the eternal sun. This was Egypt at its heart, not the stone grandeur of pyramids, but the humble, ceaseless life of those who tilled the soil, baked the bread, and gave their labor to the Nile. For without them, the Pharaohs' dreams of eternity would have crumbled to dust. At first, the gods dwelt in open air. Offerings were laid upon flat stones, or in clearings where the river's voice could be heard most strongly. A pot of grain, a libation of beer, a few beads of faience glinting in the sun. These were the humble gifts mortals gave to eternity. But over time, the desire to house the divine grew. What shelter, the people wondered, was worthy of the gods who guided the flood, who steered the sun, who guarded the dead. And so the first temples were born. They were not yet the towering halls of Karnak, nor the endless colonnades of later centuries. These early sanctuaries were fashioned of reeds and wood, fragile as the riverbanks they rose from. Their columns were bound like bundled papyrus stalks, their roofs thatched with palm. When the wind whispered through them, it seemed as though the gods themselves moved within. Inside, the air was dim, cool, and fragrant with burning resin. Priests clad in clean linen entered barefoot, their heads shaved in purity, their voices low as they chanted hymns in rhythm with the beating of their own hearts. They carried small statues of the gods, carved from wood and overlaid with gold, cradling them as though carrying children of fire and light. Every dawn, they opened the shrine, bathed the image in water, anointed it with oil, and dressed it in fresh linen. Bread, beer, figs, and roasted meats were set upon offering tables, though the gods did not eat. At sunset, the offerings were taken away and consumed by the priests, for what the gods accepted was not the food itself, but the act of devotion, the giving of the best portion. The temples soon became the beating hearts of their communities. Farmers brought their first sheaves of grain. Fishermen laid their largest catch upon the altars. Potters gave their finest bowls. In return, they believed the gods gave balance, the sacred order of Ma'at, without which the world would collapse into chaos. Imagine entering such a shrine at dusk. The last light of the sun filters through the reed walls, casting patterns that ripple like water upon the earthen floor. The smell of lotus and incense fills the air. A priest sings softly, his voice rising and falling like the breathing of the Nile itself. You place your offering at the altar, bow your head, and feel, for a moment, that eternity bends close to listen. Thus, the gods, once whispered only in stories beneath the stars, were now given houses upon the earth. And from these houses would rise, in ages to come, the greatest sanctuaries the world had ever seen. To the ancient Egyptians, life was not a single thread cut short by death. It was a tapestry woven of many strands, some visible, some unseen. When the body ceased to breathe, not all was lost, for within each person dwelt the Ka, the vital essence, the double of the self. The Ka was born with a person at birth, a companion as constant as a shadow. It was the force that animated the body, the unseen current that gave warmth to flesh, hunger to the belly, laughter to the mouth. When the body died, the Ka did not perish. It lingered, waiting, desiring still to eat, to drink, to feel the nearness of its loved ones. Thus arose the Egyptian devotion to the tomb. It was no mere resting place, but a dwelling for the Ka, a house of eternity. Inside were laid food offerings, loaves of bread, jars of beer, dried fish, honey, onions, figs, and dates. Painted upon the walls were images of servants, fields, and banquets, so that the Ka might never hunger or thirst in the world beyond. But the Ka was not alone. There was also the Ba, a more restless spirit, often depicted as a bird with a human head. The Ba could leave the tomb, flying free each dawn, visiting the world of the living, and returning each night to rejoin the body. At death, Ba and Ka were to be reunited, forming the Ak, the transfigured spirit, radiant and eternal, dwelling among the stars. This mystery was not only for kings. Common folk, too, hoped their Ka would endure. Even the humblest grave might hold a clay pot of beer, a loaf of bread, a bead of blue faience to guard the soul's passage. Each offering was an act of love, for to remember the dead was to sustain them. And so names were carved in stone, spoken in prayer, written in ink, for the Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the departed was to give them life again. Oblivion came not with death itself, but with forgetting. To be erased, to have one's name chiseled away from the wall, was the second death, a silence deeper than the tomb. Imagine, then, standing within a mastaba, torchlight flickering over painted walls. Scenes of plowing, of fishing, of musicians playing the harp glow in red and black upon plaster. Before you rests a sealed chamber, its offerings untouched for millennia, left for the Ka of the one within. The air is cool, heavy with dust, yet alive with presence, for the Egyptians knew death was not an ending, but a passage, a doorway into forever. Night draped itself over the desert, cool and vast, while the Nile shimmered like a ribbon of silver. Along its banks, the people gazed upward, toward the cliffs, the stars, and the heavens beyond. For now, their tombs were still modest, their temples small. Yet already a restlessness stirred within them, the desire to build something that would outlast not only their lives, but time itself. It was in these centuries, in the closing breaths of Egypt's first age, that the idea of the pyramid was born. At Saqqara, the architect Imhotep, servant of King Djoser, envisioned something no man had dared before. Instead of a simple mastaba of mud brick, he dreamed of stone rising in steps, tier upon tier, like a stairway carved for the Ka to climb toward eternity. By torchlight, men dragged heavy blocks across the sand, the sound of ropes groaning, sledges grinding, voices chanting in rhythm. The smell of sweat mingled with the faint perfume of incense burned in offering. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly, indifferent yet eternal, while the moon cast its cold blessing upon their labor. When at last the step pyramid rose, it was unlike anything the world had seen. A mountain of stone, deliberate and enduring, its shadow stretching across the desert like the mark of a god's hand. It was not only a tomb for a king, it was a promise carved into eternity, a declaration that Egypt had found a way to touch the heavens. From that moment, Egypt entered a new age, the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid builders, when stone became language and kings built monuments not for themselves alone, but for the very idea of eternity. And so the chapter closes beneath the moon's silver gaze. Villagers and kings alike looked upon the rising monuments and felt both awe and certainty. Egypt had stepped into its destiny. The Nile would flood, the crops would grow, the gods would watch, and the stone would endure long after flesh had faded to dust. Thus ended the first whisperings of the Nile, and thus began the age of giants in stone. In the reign of King Djoser, the desert stirred with a dream unlike any the world had known. His chief architect was Imhotep, physician, scribe, priest, seer. His mind was a vessel of vision, his hands steady as the chisel that struck stone. To later generations, he would be worshipped as a god of wisdom and healing. But in these first days, he was simply a man who dreamed beyond the horizon of his time. Before Imhotep, the dead were laid to rest in mastabas, flat-roofed tombs of mud brick, sturdy but fleeting, like echoes fading in sand. Imhotep looked upon them and thought, why should the house of eternity be made of dust? Why not of stone, eternal and unyielding? He designed a tomb not of one mastaba, but of 6, each rising upon the other, a stairway carved for the Ka to ascend. Blocks of limestone were cut from quarries, dragged on sledges over sand moistened with water to ease their passage. The desert air thrummed with the groan of ropes, the chant of laborers, the clatter of tools on stone. Day after day, the structure rose. Tier upon tier, gleaming white in the sun, it caught the light of Ra himself. Villagers came from miles away to stand in awe. Children pointed, elders whispered, priests raised their hands in prayer. For never before had humankind shaped such a mountain, not of earth, but of deliberate stone, carved by will alone. When it was complete, the step pyramid of Saqqara stretched skyward, a beacon to the heavens. Within its hidden chambers lay offerings, chambers, and corridors where Djoser's Ka would dwell for eternity. Around it, temples and courtyards spread like wings, places for ritual and remembrance. At night, when the moon rose, the pyramid glowed pale against the dark sky. To stand before it was to feel the weight of eternity pressing close, to sense that the boundary between mortal and divine had been thinned. And so, with Imhotep's vision, Egypt entered its age of pyramids. Stone had become the language of the gods, and the kings of Egypt would spend centuries writing their prayers upon the desert. After Imhotep's daring vision, the kings of Egypt hungered for greater monuments still. The step pyramid was but the beginning, a stairway to heaven. But what if, they wondered, eternity could be housed not in steps, but in perfection? A shape so pure that it echoed the rays of the sun itself. Thus began the age of the true pyramids. At first, the builders experimented. At Mitam, a pyramid collapsed in ruin, its angles too steep, its foundations uncertain. At Dashur, another bent in the desert, the bent pyramid, rising steeply before its builders, learning caution, lowered the slope midway, leaving it with 2 faces, half daring, half retreat. Yet even in failure, the vision sharpened. Each error carved the path toward perfection. And then came Giza. On the west bank of the Nile, where the desert meets the fertile plain, the kings of the 4th dynasty staked their claim upon eternity. The first was Khufu, who envisioned a monument so vast it would outlast time itself. His pyramid would not bend nor crumble, but rise as a flawless triangle of light. For decades, laborers hauled stone from quarries, some blocks weighing as much as 40 men could lift. Sledges scraped across sand, water poured to ease their path. Ramps wound upward like earthen serpents, carrying blocks skyward. The desert rang with the thud of wooden mallets, the rasp of copper chisels, the chant of work crews bound in rhythm to their task. Slowly, impossibly, the great pyramid rose, 4 sides aligned with the cardinal points, its base so precise that even in ages to come, it would puzzle the minds of scholars. When finished, Its surface was clad in gleaming white limestone, so bright that at dawn it caught the sun and blazed like a second horizon. Beside it, Khafre raised his own pyramid, nearly as tall, guarded by the silent, mysterious gaze of the Great Sphinx. Menkaure followed with a third, smaller yet still majestic, forming a triad that would dominate the desert skyline for millennia. At night, the pyramids of Giza stood like mountains of moonlight, their edges sharp against the stars. Some say they were aligned with Orion's belt, a reflection of the heavens upon the earth, a map of eternity carved in stone. For those who walked beneath their shadow, the pyramids were not merely tombs. They were proof that Egypt's kings had harnessed eternity itself, shaping stone into light, chaos into order, mortality into immortality. And as the rising giants touched the sky, Egypt entered an age of glory that seemed it would never fade. In the shadow of the pyramids, Egypt's kings walked as more than mortals. To their people, the pharaoh was the very embodiment of Horus, the falcon of the sky, his eyes bright as the sun and moon. When he strode through the courtyards of temples, banners fluttering before him, the air grew still, for all knew that they beheld not just a man, but the chosen guardian of Ma'at, the sacred balance that held chaos at bay. The pharaoh's titles spoke of his dual nature. He was lord of the two lands, ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, his double crown gleaming with red and white. He was son of Ra, born from the light of the sun, destined to rise each morning and set each night, only to return again. He was beloved of the gods, chosen to perform rituals that ensured the flood would come, the crops would grow, and the stars would remain steady in their paths. When the king appeared in festival processions, he wore robes of fine linen, their folds shimmering like sunlight upon water. Around his neck hung amulets of gold and lapis lazuli, stones believed to carry eternity within them. In his hands, he bore the crook and flail, symbols of shepherd and judge, protector and punisher. His subjects knelt as he passed, their heads bowed to the earth, for to look upon him directly was to risk beholding divinity too closely. Yet the pharaoh was not distant. In ritual, he performed the sacred duties that bound the world together. At dawn, he entered the temple sanctuaries, offering incense and food to the gods, reciting hymns that had been spoken since the first days of creation. He raised libations to the sky, sprinkling water over the altar to echo the gift of the Nile's flood. Each gesture was more than ceremony. It was renewal, the turning of the wheel that kept heaven and earth in harmony. But even in this aura of godhood, there lingered a truth. The pharaoh's body was mortal, could wither, bleed, and die. And so, to preserve his divinity beyond the grave, elaborate tombs were prepared, filled with treasures and prayers, so that the king might continue his reign in the afterlife. For a pharaoh who failed to uphold Ma'at would not only doom himself, but risk plunging all Egypt into chaos. Imagine the king at sunset, standing before the horizon, his silhouette sharp against the golden sky, falcons circling above him, priests chanting in deep voices as incense smoke curls upward. He raises his arms to Ra, the great sun, and the people watching whisper to themselves, "He is not only our ruler, he is the axis upon which the world turns." Thus Egypt's kings became gods on earth, guardians of order, bearers of eternity, and the living pulse of the land they ruled. Though the kings of Egypt strode forth as gods, their rule was rarely theirs alone. At their sides stood women whose strength was quiet yet profound, their presence woven into the very fabric of eternity. The queen was more than a consort. She was the mother of heirs, the guardian of lineage, the living embodiment of Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and fertility. Without her, the pharaoh's claim to divinity was incomplete, for she anchored his rule to blood, to family, to the cycles of birth and renewal. In temples, she was depicted standing just behind the king, offering flowers to the gods, pouring libations of milk and honey. Her crown bore horns cradling the solar disk, or the tall vulture headdress that proclaimed her as protector of Egypt's children. She walked in measured grace, her long linen gown shimmering in folds, her hair bound in elaborate braids woven with beads of turquoise and gold. Some queens wielded power openly, Mernith, in the earliest dynasties, may have ruled as regent in her son's youth, her name carved on stones steely with royal honors. Others influenced in subtler ways, whispering counsel in the palace halls, guiding alliances, securing marriages, weaving a web of diplomacy that extended Egypt's reach far beyond its deserts. Their tombs, too, bore witness to their stature. At Abydos and Giza, queens rested in mastabas and small pyramids beside their kings, their walls painted with offerings, their names inscribed so that their ka would endure. Some even had mortuary temples of their own, where priests chanted prayers for their eternal life. But their true power lay not in stone or title, but in the way they were remembered, as mothers of kings, as priestesses of the gods, as keepers of balance in palace and temple alike. For though the pharaoh was the blazing sun, the queen was the moon, reflecting his light, softening it, guiding the cycles of time. Imagine her at twilight, seated in a shaded courtyard, the fragrance of lotus rising from nearby pools. Children play at her feet, servants bring figs and wine, and musicians pluck soft notes from harps. Yet her gaze is distant, her thoughts not on the evening's comfort but on the future of her house, her land, her people. For she knows that her choices, quiet and unseen, ripple outward like the Nile itself, shaping destinies yet unborn. Thus, in the golden glow of Egypt's early age, queens stood as pillars beside their kings, not always named, not always remembered, yet always present, steady as stone, soft as breath, eternal as the river. Beneath the sun of Giza, where the sands shift endlessly with the wind, there lies a creature neither man nor beast, yet both, the great Sphinx. Its body is that of a crouching lion, its face that of a king, its gaze fixed forever eastward, toward the rising sun. The stone from which it was carved was already ancient when the first chisels struck it. Bedrock hardened by millennia yielded slowly, as laborers scraped and hammered, removing what was unnecessary until only the vast form remained. Its paws stretched long across the desert floor, its shoulders broad as a temple wall, its silent mouth pressed in eternal calm. Some say it was made in the image of King Khafre, guardian of his pyramid. Others whisper it was older still, born of a forgotten age, its true purpose lost to time. Yet all agreed it was no mere statue. The Sphinx was a watcher, a sentinel, a bridge between the strength of earth and the mystery of the heavens. At dawn, the sun rose directly before its gaze, flooding its face with light. Priests gathered in the early morning chill, raising their arms in prayer as incense smoke curled into the sky. They believed the Sphinx was bound to Horus of the horizon, the falcon of dawn, who soared from darkness into day. To look upon its face was to feel the presence of the divine, silent and immeasurable. In later centuries, sands would creep up its flanks, swallowing its body until only the head remained, peering from the desert like a dream half-buried. Yet even then, it was never forgotten. Pilgrims left offerings, kings restored its stones, poets carved steely at its feet, recording visions and prayers granted by the silent guardian. Imagine standing before it on a moonlit night. The pyramids loom dark behind, the desert stretches endless before, and the Sphinx gazes over it all unblinking. The air is cool, filled with the rustle of sand carried on the breeze. You feel, in its presence, not the passage of time, but its suspension, as if the creature breathes not in years, but in eternities. The pyramids declared power. The Sphinx whispered mystery. Together, they crowned the old kingdom with a majesty that would never be forgotten, even as the ages carried Egypt toward both glory and decline. Amid the grandeur of pyramids and temples, another power thrived, not in stone or gold, but in ink. The scribe was Egypt's silent pillar, the guardian of words, the keeper of order. Without him, the will of kings and gods would have drifted like dust across the desert, forgotten. Each morning, the scribe sat with a roll of papyrus unrolled before him, its pale surface smooth as polished ivory. In his hand was a pen made from a slender reed, its tip chewed soft, dipped in black or red ink ground from soot and ochre. With steady strokes, he filled the surface with signs, falcons, cobras, reeds, eyes, waves, each a sound, a word, a thought bound to eternity. The air in the scribe's chamber was cool, shaded from the harsh sun. The scent of ink, sharp and earthy, clung to his fingers. Around him, clay tablets, scrolls, and pallets lay scattered, each holding records of harvests, tax accounts, temple offerings, hymns, and prayers. The hum of the world outside, the cries of merchants, the bleating of goats, the chatter of children, seemed distant here, for the scribe moved in another realm, the realm of permanence. To write was not only a craft but a sacred act. The Egyptians believed that words carried power. To speak a spell was to summon its force, but to write it was to anchor it beyond time. A scribe could preserve the name of a king, ensuring his ka lived on. He could record laws, making them binding for generations. He could inscribe prayers upon tomb walls, so the dead would never hunger nor thirst. Yet the life of a scribe was not only solemn. He was also a bridge between the high and the humble. He might sit at the feet of a pharaoh, recording decrees, and then walk through the fields, tallying bushels of barley for the tax collectors. He might copy ancient hymns in careful script by lamplight, then compose playful letters for merchants, filled with jokes and blessings. His ink bound together the world's lofty dreams and its daily bread. In Egyptian wisdom texts, scribes praised their calling above all others. The farmer toils in the sun, his body bent, his hands blistered. The soldier marches into danger, his life uncertain. But the scribe, his words endure. Imagine him at night, seated by a small oil lamp, the flame flickering golden on papyrus as he bends close to his work. Outside, the Nile breathes in its endless rhythm. But here, within these walls, the quiet scratching of the pen echoes louder than any flood. For in those strokes lies eternity. The year was measured not only by floods and harvests, but by festivals, days when work ceased, when the air grew fragrant with incense and song, when the people honored the gods who bound their world together. Among the greatest of these was the Festival of the Sun, a celebration of Ra, the radiant one who sailed across the sky each day in his golden bark. At dawn, before the horizon blushed with light, priests gathered in the temple courts. They bathed in cool water, dressed in white linen, and prepared offerings of bread, fruit, flowers, and jars of sweet beer. As the first rays of the sun broke over the desert, they lifted their arms in praise, chanting hymns that echoed like birdsong through the colonnades. The people crowded outside, dressed in their finest linen. Women adorned themselves with necklaces of faience and turquoise. Men oiled their skin until it glowed like bronze in the morning light. Children carried lotus blossoms, their petals glistening with dew. Music filled the air, the deep hum of drums, the ringing of sistrums shaken in rhythm, the reedy cry of flutes. Dancers moved in circles, their arms rising like wings, their anklets jingling with shells. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the sweetness of honey cakes and figs, carried on the warm breeze. In the heart of the festival came the procession of the god. From the innermost shrine of the temple, priests carried forth a gilded bark, upon which rested the image of Ra draped in linen and shining with gold. The god's effigy glowed in the morning sun. The people bowed low, voices rising in prayer. Thanks for the flood, thanks for the harvest, thanks for another day of light. The procession wound through the streets, banners fluttering, incense burners smoking, children scattering petals before the god's path. Families clasped hands, strangers embraced, laughter and song mingled freely. For in those hours, Egypt felt itself renewed, its people bound together by joy as much as by reverence. As the sun reached its zenith, feasting began. Bread and beer flowed freely, figs and pomegranates passed from hand to hand. Storytellers recited hymns and myths, recalling how Ra sailed across the sky, how he defeated the serpent of chaos each night so that dawn might return. The festival was both memory and hope, both prayer and celebration. And when the sun set, the people returned to their homes, weary yet joyous, their hearts filled with certainty. Ra would rise again tomorrow, and with him life itself would be renewed. Thus the festivals of Egypt wove together the sacred and the simple, the eternal and the everyday, proof that even in joy, the people's lives were bound to the rhythm of the gods. Beneath the shadow of Giza's towering monuments, where the desert meets the fertile fields, a small city once stirred with life. It was not a place of kings or priests, but of workers, thousands of men and women whose labor gave form to the pharaoh's dream. Here, rows of modest mud-brick houses lined narrow streets. The air smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. Children played in the dust, chasing dogs and throwing pebbles, their laughter mingling with the distant thud of mallets striking stone. Women wove baskets, ground grain, and brewed jars of beer, while men returned from the quarries and ramps, their skin darkened by sun, their bodies weary yet strong. Contrary to later tales of slaves, these workers were free Egyptians, drawn from across the land in rotation, serving the king in exchange for food, shelter, and honor. They were fed well, their rations including bread, onions, garlic, and fish from the Nile. Each day they drank beer, thick and nourishing, safer than water, sustaining them through their toil. Their labor was immense. At dawn, they marched in groups to the pyramid site, ropes slung across shoulders, voices chanting as they hauled sledges heavy with limestone blocks. Overseers marked the rhythm with staffs, ensuring unity in movement, for a block too heavy for one man was manageable for 50 working as one. In the evenings, the village came alive with sound. Drums echoed, flutes played, stories were told by firelight. Workers spoke of their homes, their families, their hopes that their names, too, would endure. Some carved graffiti into the stones, leaving behind the marks of their crews, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkaure, small human traces hidden beneath the grandeur. Death was not absent here. Injuries were common, bones bore signs of strain. Yet the dead were buried with care, their bodies wrapped in linen, placed in simple graves near the village. Even in service, they were not forgotten, for their work was believed to aid not only the king's eternity, but their own. Imagine walking through the village at twilight. The pyramids loom above, vast and silent, while below, the streets glow with firelight. The scent of stew drifts through the air, laughter rises. A dog barks in the distance. The giants of stone belong to kings, but this warmth, this hum of life, belonged to the builders. And though their names were not carved in gold, their sweat and breath are in every block. Without them, the pyramids would be sand, the dream of eternity unbuilt. Their village, long buried beneath desert sands, whispers still of the human hands that shaped forever. In Egypt, justice was not born from human decree alone. It flowed from the eternal principle of Ma'at, truth, balance, harmony. To live in Ma'at was to walk in the order set forth at creation. To stray from it was to invite Isfit, chaos, the unraveling of all that was. The pharaoh was the living guardian of Ma'at, yet he could not carry the burden alone. Across the two lands, judges and officials acted in his name, gathering in quiet chambers to settle disputes. Their courtrooms were not grand palaces, but simple halls open to the people. There, beneath painted images of falcons and serpents, justice unfolded like ritual. At the heart of the chamber stood the image of Ma'at herself, a goddess crowned with a single feather. That feather was the measure of truth, both in life and beyond death. When disputes were brought forth over land, over water rights, over inheritance, the judge invoked her name, seeking not vengeance but balance. The proceedings were calm, deliberate. Witnesses gave their words. Scribes bent over papyrus, recording each phrase in careful script. No one raised their voice, for to disturb the stillness was to dishonor Ma'at. The judge listened, weighing words like stones in a balance. At last, his verdict was spoken not as punishment, but as restoration, to set right what had been bent, to smooth what had been broken. And always the people believed the gods listened. For the same feather of Ma'at that governed earthly courts also awaited each soul in the hall of judgment beyond death. There, the heart of the departed would be weighed upon golden scales against the feather's lightness. If the heart was pure, the soul was welcomed into eternity. If it was heavy with deceit, it was devoured by Amit, the devourer, and vanished into silence. Thus, to live justly was not only to find peace in this life, but to secure eternity in the next. Imagine such a hall at midday. The air is thick with incense. Sunlight filters through high windows, casting shafts of gold upon the floor. The judge sits cross-legged, serene, his hands folded. The scribe's pen scratches softly. The people kneel, waiting. And in that silence, truth is sought, not for one man alone, but for the balance of all Egypt. The court of Maat was not merely law, but the soul of the nation. And as long as Maat was upheld, Egypt believed the Nile would flood, the stars would remain steady, and life itself would endure. For centuries, the old kingdom had risen like the pyramids themselves, firm, radiant, reaching toward the sky. Kings had commanded stone into eternity. Priests had tended the gods' houses. Scribes had bound memory in ink. It seemed that Egypt, ordered by Maat, would endure unshaken forever. And yet, even the brightest sun must set. The wealth that raised pyramids vast as mountains came not without cost. Quarries were emptied, treasuries strained. Farmers burdened with the weight of feeding both their own households and the great projects of kings. When the Nile's flood faltered, harvests failed, and hunger crept like shadow into the villages. In the palaces, the power of the pharaoh grew thinner, stretched like gold hammered too fine. Local governors, the nomarchs, once loyal stewards, began to rule their provinces as near-kings, their authority swelling as the central throne weakened. Temples, too, gathered wealth and land, their priests commanding devotion once reserved only for the crown. The pyramids, once symbols of unity, became heavy with irony, silent giants rising over a land fraying at its edges. For while stone endured, the balance of Maat faltered in the hearts of men. There were whispers of drought, years when the Nile did not rise as before. Without its flood, fields cracked and black earth turned to dust. Villages struggled, families scattered. Prayers rose to the heavens with no answer. Hunger gnawed at the land, and with hunger came unrest. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh's voice no longer carried across the two lands as it once had. Kings still wore the double crown, but their grip was fragile, their glory dimmed. The age of the great pyramid builders closed, leaving behind monuments that gleamed in the desert even as the people who raised them faced uncertainty. Imagine standing at Giza in these fading days. The pyramids still rise, unshaken, their tips catching the sun. Yet around them, villages are weary, granaries low, and hope is thin as reed paper. The stone declares eternity, but the people whisper of change. Thus ended Egypt's first great age. The Old Kingdom, once a beacon of unshakable order, yielded to chaos and division. But though the crown wavered, the Nile still flowed, and in its promise lay the seed of rebirth. For Egypt, like the sun, would set, only to rise again. When the Old Kingdom dimmed, Egypt entered what later ages would call the First Intermediate Period, an age of shadows, when the voice of the pharaoh was faint and the two lands seemed no longer one. The nomarchs, governors of each province, grew powerful in their independence. In the south, cities like Thebes and Heracleopolis rose as rival centers, each with its own lords, its own banners, its own courts of justice. Without the pharaoh's firm hand, Egypt's unity dissolved into a patchwork of small kingdoms, sometimes trading with one another, sometimes at odds. For the common people, life was harder. With the Nile's floods less reliable, harvests faltered. Famine left its mark in sunken cheeks and weary eyes. The tombs of this time, humbler than the pyramids, reveal prayers etched into their walls, not only for eternity, but for simple bread and water in this life. Yet even in hardship, Egypt did not collapse into ruin. Families endured, tending their fields, offering to their gods, singing songs that remembered the golden days of the past. Local lords commissioned small tombs, decorated with scenes of daily life, hunting, weaving, plowing, fishing. These were no longer the grand declarations of eternity carved for kings, but the hopes of common men and women that their Ka would be remembered. In the silence of the weakened throne, voices long unheard began to rise. Poets and scribes wrote laments, reflections on the frailty of kings and the suffering of the land. The river is dry, men wander thirsty. The poor man's voice is loud, the great man's voice is gone. These words, etched on fragile papyrus, tell us of a people aware of the turning of the world, aware that even the eternal can falter. And yet, scattered among the laments were prayers of hope. The people still believed in Ma'at, in balance, in renewal. They looked to the horizon, waiting for a king who might restore order, who might bind the two lands once more into harmony. Imagine standing by the Nile in these years. The fields are thinner, the villages quieter, the great monuments distant reminders of a brighter time. Yet the river still flows, the stars still turn overhead, and the people still lift their eyes to the heavens. For Egypt, though wounded, was not dead. Beneath the dust of disunity, the seed of rebirth slept, waiting for the hand of destiny. Thus began the long road back to greatness, not in sudden triumph, but in quiet endurance, until the day when Egypt's heart would beat strongly again. While the north faltered under rival lords, it was in the southern lands that a flame of unity flickered back to life. Thebes, a city framed by desert cliffs and fertile plains, began as but one among many, yet its gods, its rulers, and its people would shape the course of Egypt's rebirth. The city was devoted above all to Ammonius, a god once minor, worshipped as the hidden one, unseen yet ever present. His temple at Karnak was modest then, built of mud brick and reeds, its sanctuary perfumed with incense, its shrine cradled in dim lamplight. Yet even in those simple beginnings, there lingered a sense of power, a quiet majesty waiting to unfold. The lords of Thebes, calling themselves kings though their realm was small, began to gather strength. Their rule was not gilded with pyramids but built upon alliances, the loyalty of soldiers, and the devotion of their people. They organized armies to defend their lands. They secured trade routes along the river, and above all, they claimed to uphold Ma'at, restoring the balance that chaos had unraveled. In their courts, scribes wrote not of despair but of order slowly returning. Grain was counted, granaries filled once more, and festivals held to honor the gods. The Nile, though still fickle, began to bless the land with steadier floods, and with its gift came renewed hope. Thebes grew not only in power but in vision. Its rulers dreamed of more than survival, they dreamed of reuniting Egypt. They looked north, across the wide sweep of river and desert, where rival lords held sway, and they whispered of destiny. For the two lands were meant to be one, as they had been in the days of Narmer and Djoser. Imagine Thebes in these early years. The river glimmers in the afternoon sun. Farmers carry baskets heavy with figs and onions through the markets. Priests move silently into the sanctuary of Ammonius, carrying lotus flowers, their fragrance thick in the warm air. And above it all, in the palace, the Theban ruler looks northward, his eyes narrowing with determination. The city was not yet great, but greatness stirred within it. In time, it would grow to be Egypt's beating heart, the seat of kings who stretched their power from Nubia to the Levant. But here, in the first whispers of its rise, it was enough that Thebes dreamed, and in dreaming laid the foundation for empire. The Nile still flowed, but Egypt was divided. In the north, rival lords held sway, their banners fluttering over fields and cities. In the south, Thebes stood proud, its rulers no longer content with half a land. They dreamed of unity, and unity would be won not with words alone, but with steel and resolve. The warrior pharaohs arose from this vision. They were kings who donned the double crown not only in ritual but in conquest. Their chariots rattled over the desert sands. Their spears gleamed in the sun. Their banners carried the falcon of Horus and the hidden power of Ammonius. Battles were fought along the Nile's length. Villages watched from the banks as armies marched past. Rows of archers with bows strung tight, infantry carrying shields of cowhide, chariots pulled by swift horses, their wheels creaking on the stone roads. The drums of war echoed against the cliffs, and the cries of the soldiers rose like storms across the plain. Yet these were not wars of endless chaos, for the people believed they were wars of restoration. struggles to bring Egypt once more into the balance of Nile. The warrior pharaohs marched not for plunder, but for order, for the binding of the two lands under one crown, as it had been in ages past. At last, after long struggle, the banners of Thebes were carried north, and the rivals were subdued. Once more Egypt was whole. The king, standing at the heart of Thebes, raised the double crown above his brow, the white of the south, the red of the north, and the people rejoiced. Priests chanted hymns to Ammonius, incense burned thick, and offerings of bread, beer, and oxen were laid upon the temple altars. These kings were remembered not only as rulers but as liberators, who restored unity when the land lay divided. Their names were etched into temple walls, their victories painted in vivid color, their images striding forward with bow and mace in hand. Yet when the battles ended, the kings laid aside their arms and returned to the duties of peace. They rebuilt temples, restored tombs, and filled the land once more with festivals of joy. For they knew that victory was not only measured in conquest, but in harmony, in the return of balance to a people long wearied by division. Imagine Thebes in this moment of triumph. The streets are alive with celebration, drums echoing, garlands of lotus flowers cast into the river. Children cheer, women sing, men raise cups of beer in toasts to their king. Above it all, the temple of Ammonius stands wreathed in smoke and song, as priests declare the land reborn. Thus, the warrior pharaohs gave Egypt back its unity, and from that unity would rise an age not only of survival, but of empire. With the land reunited beneath Theban kings, Egypt breathed again. The famine-scarred fields grew green, temples rang with hymns, and the Nile seemed to flow more generously, as though pleased with the return of order. This was the beginning of what later ages would remember as the Middle Kingdom, a second golden age, quieter than the first, yet rich with its own splendor. The pharaohs of this age were not only warriors but shepherds. They walked among their people as guardians, protectors of the weak, restorers of justice. Their inscriptions did not boast only of conquest but of compassion. Tales of canals dug to water thirsty lands, of granaries filled to prevent famine, of temples raised to honor gods both great and small. Art and literature flourished. Scribes penned stories not only of kings and gods, but of wanderers, dreamers, and common men. Tales like the story of Sinew, of a courtier who fled into exile and longed for home, revealed a new tenderness in Egyptian thought, a recognition of the human heart, with its fears, hopes, and yearning for belonging. Wisdom texts, too, multiplied. Teachings of fathers to sons, of officials to apprentices, guiding them not in war, but in the ways of balance, humility, and truth. The tombs of this age, carved into cliffs and valleys, glowed with painted scenes of daily life. Fishermen casting nets, farmers harvesting barley, women grinding grain, children splashing in the river. It was as though the Egyptians had turned their eyes from the sheer grandeur of pyramids to the intimate details of life, declaring that eternity was not only for kings, but for all who lived with honor. Trade expanded as well. Ships sailed down the Nile and beyond, to the lands of Nubia and the Levant. They returned laden with ebony, ivory, gold, incense, and rare stones. These treasures filled temples and adorned the tombs of nobles, but more importantly, they wove Egypt into the wider tapestry of the ancient world. Imagine a Middle Kingdom festival in Thebes. The streets bustle with merchants selling figs and honey cakes. Musicians play soft harps and flutes, their notes drifting into the night. Children chase one another with laughter, while priests carry small effigies of Ammonius through the crowd, blessing the people. Above it all, the temple rises, its walls glowing orange in the last light of the setting sun. The Middle Kingdom was not as towering in stone as the old, but it was vast in spirit. Its strength lay not in pyramids but in wisdom, not in monumentality but in compassion. It was a time when Egypt remembered itself, and in remembering, grew luminous once more. Beyond the familiar fields of Egypt, beyond the cliffs that guarded the Nile's valley, there lay a world of distant lands, and among them, none shone brighter in Egyptian memory than Punt, the god's land. The voyages began in the Middle Kingdom, when the pharaohs, eager to adorn their temples and sanctuaries, sought the treasures that could not be found in their own soil. Chief among these were frankincense and myrrh, the sacred resins whose smoke curled upward in temples, carrying prayers to the gods. Egypt had gold, stone, and grain in abundance, but for the scent of heaven itself, they turned their eyes across the sea. Ships were built upon the Nile's banks, long and slender, their timbers bound with ropes, their sails cut from linen. Crews of oarsmen and sailors gathered, their bodies strong from years on the river. Before setting forth, priests blessed the ships with offerings of bread and beer, anointing the prows with oil to call upon the gods' protection. Then came the journey. Down the Nile they drifted, past towns and temples, until at last they reached the shores of the Red Sea. There, they launched into waters less familiar, following the winds southward, hugging the coastlines, guided by stars that shone strange to their eyes. The land of Punt, when at last they reached it, was a place of wonder. The Egyptians rode of green hills, incense trees heavy with resin, baboons and exotic animals, and people adorned with gold and ivory. The air itself seemed perfumed, filled with the resinous sweetness that would later burn in Egypt's sanctuaries. Trade was warm and reverent. Punt was not conquered, but befriended. The Egyptians exchanged beads, weapons, and grain for incense, ebony, and rare animals, which returned with them to the Nile. Back in Egypt, the arrival of a Punt fleet was a festival. Processions carried the incense into temples. Priests scattered resin upon altars, and golden smoke rose in curling streams, a sign that the gods were pleased. Pharaohs inscribed these voyages upon temple walls, recording them as proof of divine favor and human daring. Imagine standing upon a Red Sea shore as one of these ships prepares to return. The hull creaks beneath the weight of cargo, jars of resin, baskets of ivory, cages of strange animals. Sailors laugh and embrace their hosts, offering final gifts before the ropes are loosed. The sail rises, catching the wind, and the ship begins its long journey home, carrying not only goods, but the fragrance of a land forever woven into Egypt's dream. Thus the voyages to Punt became part of Egypt's eternal memory, a reaching outward, a stretching of hand across the waters, to bring the perfume of distant gods into the temples of the Nile. To the south of Egypt stretched Nubia, a land both kindred and distinct, where the Nile carved its path through rocky gorges and deserts of copper-red sand. Its people, dark-skinned and proud, dwelled in villages of mud brick and reed, herded cattle along the river's banks, and raised temples to their own gods, many of whom were kin to Egypt's. Nubia was known above all for its wealth. Gold glimmered in its riverbeds and mountains, drawn forth in shining nuggets and dust, carried northward to enrich the temples of Thebes and Memphis. Ebony wood, ivory from elephants, and ostrich feathers were gathered there, along with exotic animals, leopards, giraffes, and monkeys, all treasures that the pharaohs prized. Egypt and Nubia were bound by both friendship and rivalry. Traders journeyed south with beads, weapons, and fine linen, returning with gold and cattle. Yet at times, Egypt sought not only trade, but control. Fortresses of stone were built along the river's southern reaches, their walls strong against Nubian spears, their watchtowers gazing far across the desert. Soldiers stationed there patrolled the banks, guarding caravans and ensuring Egypt's dominion. But Nubia was never merely a subject. Its warriors were fierce, their bows long, their arrows swift. Nubian archers became famed as mercenaries in Egyptian armies, their skill so great that songs were sung of them. Their cattle herds were vast, their traditions deep, their gods honored with the same reverence as Egypt's own. And in time, the relationship between the two lands would grow more entwined. Nubian kings would one day rule Egypt itself, wearing the double crown with pride, their dynasty remembered as both foreign and yet deeply Egyptian. In the Middle Kingdom, however, Nubia's wealth flowed steadily north, enriching temples and palaces. Priests burned Nubian incense before Ammonius' image, nobles draped themselves in Nubian gold, and the treasures of the south became woven into Egypt's daily life. Imagine a caravan returning from Nubia. Donkeys laden with ivory tusks and baskets of gold dust march slowly along the riverbank. Soldiers walk beside them, shields gleaming in the sun. Children run out from villages to watch, pointing at the exotic animals led in chains. A leopard with golden eyes, a baboon chattering restlessly. The caravan reaches Thebes at twilight, greeted by priests who raise their hands in blessing, as though the wealth of Nubia were itself a sacred offering. Thus Nubia stood as Egypt's southern mirror, sometimes ally, sometimes rival, always essential. And in that bond of trade and tension, Egypt grew not only richer, but more deeply tied to the great sweep of lands beyond its borders. Along the eastern bank of the Nile, where the river bends gently beneath the desert cliffs, a city of devotion was born in stone. Here, in Thebes, the Egyptians raised the greatest temple complex of their land, Karnak, the dwelling place of Ammonius, the hidden one, whose power would soon rise above all other gods. At first, Karnak was modest, a small shrine of mud brick, perfumed with incense, visited by priests who whispered hymns in the cool shadows. But as Thebes grew in power, so too did Ammonius' sanctuary. Pharaoh after pharaoh added to its splendor, each carving their devotion into walls and pylons, each leaving their mark upon eternity. The approach to Karnak was lined with avenues of sphinxes, their lion bodies crouched in silent ranks, their heads carved as rams or kings. To walk between them was to step into the presence of divinity, the air heavy with incense and the sound of sistrums ringing in the hands of priestesses. Beyond the entrance rose pylons vast as cliffs, their walls painted with scenes of kings smiting enemies, of gods bestowing crowns. Passing through their gates, one entered into a world of colonnades and courtyards, sacred lakes and hidden chambers. The great hypostyle hall, with its forest of columns thick as tree trunks, soared toward the heavens, each pillar carved with hieroglyphs, painted in vivid reds, blues, and golds. Light filtered through the high slits above, illuminating dust motes that swirled like stars in a twilight sky. Within, priests tended the god's image, kept hidden in the innermost sanctuary. Each morning they bathed the statue, anointed it with fragrant oils, clothed it in fresh linen, and laid offerings of bread, fruit, and meat before it. By night, they returned the god to his chamber, as though Ammonius truly lived among them, unseen yet ever present. Karnak was more than temple. It was the pulse of Egypt. Festivals began here, most famously the Opet festival, when Ammonius' image was carried in a bark down the avenue to Luxor, accompanied by crowds singing, dancing, feasting. It was here that kings came to seek legitimacy, presenting offerings to Ammonius so that his hidden power might strengthen their rule. Imagine standing in Karnak at dawn. The columns glow faintly as the sun's first rays strike them. Priests in white linen move in silence, carrying jars of cool water, bundles of lotus flowers, and trays of incense. The chanting begins, low and steady, filling the vast space with a sound that seems to come not from human throats, but from the stone itself. The fragrance of frankincense rises, golden smoke curling toward the sky. Karnak grew for centuries, never truly finished, each ruler adding his stone to the living body of the god. And though empires have come and gone, the temple still stands, its columns weathered but proud, its avenues open to the sun and stars. It is, even now, a place where the breath of ancient Egypt lingers, eternal as the Nile. In the long line of Egypt's kings, there came at times a woman strong enough to bear the double crown. Among them, none shone brighter than Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose, wife of a king and mother of a dynasty. When her husband died, leaving a young heir too small to rule, Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent. At first, she guided the throne in her stepson's name, but in time her role grew, her voice steady, her vision commanding, until she no longer stood behind the throne. She was the throne. She declared herself pharaoh, chosen of Ammonius, rightful ruler of the two lands. Her image was carved in stone as a king, broad-chested, wearing the false beard, crowned with the double diadem of Upper and Lower Egypt. Yet beneath this royal guise was a woman whose rule brought peace, wealth, and vision to her land. Hatshepsut's reign was marked not by conquest, but by prosperity. She reopened trade routes long abandoned, sending grand expeditions once more to Punt. Ships returned heavy with incense trees, myrrh, ebony, and gold, their treasures inscribed upon the walls of her mortuary temple. She restored temples and raised monuments, each bearing her name, each proclaiming her as the beloved of Ammonius. Her greatest creation was the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, carved against the cliffs of western Thebes. Terraces of white stone rose in graceful tiers, connected by ramps and lined with colonnades. Its walls told stories of her reign, the divine birth she claimed from Ammonius, the journey to Punt, the offerings she laid before the gods. To walk through its courtyards was to walk through the vision of a ruler who saw eternity not in war, but in harmony. Though she ruled as king, she did not erase her womanhood. She stood as proof that power could wear many forms, that Ma'at could be upheld by the wisdom of a queen as surely as by the strength of a warrior. Her reign stretched long and stable, the land prosperous, the people at peace. Imagine standing before Deir el-Bahari at dawn. The cliffs glow rose-red in the morning light, the temple's colonnades white as bone. Incense drifts from its altars. Priests chant her name in reverence. In the still air, her image carved in stone gazes outward, serene, eternal. Hatshepsut's successors would attempt to erase her, chiseling her name from monuments, shattering her statues. Yet the stone endured, and now her reign stands among the brightest of Egypt's story. A woman who wore the crown, who ruled in peace, and whose vision remains carved against the cliffs of eternity. When Hatshepsut passed into eternity, her stepson at last stepped fully into the throne. Where she had built peace through trade and temples, Thutmose III sought glory through conquest and dominion. He became known as the Napoleon of Egypt. Though long before such names were spoken, he had already carved his fame in stone. His reign was marked by a series of campaigns that carried Egypt's power beyond its borders. Northward into Canaan, eastward into Syria, he led his armies through valleys and over mountains, his chariots clattering upon dusty roads. His soldiers bore shields of hide, spears and bows gleaming in the sun, their ranks disciplined, their chants steady as the beat of drums. The most famed of his battles was fought at Megiddo, where rival kings had gathered in defiance of Egypt. Thutmose, daring where others hesitated, chose a narrow mountain pass for his advance. His officers feared the risk, but he pressed on, and by his boldness, victory was won. The enemy was caught unprepared, their forces scattered. The spoils of Megiddo filled Egypt's treasuries with horses, chariots, and riches, but greater still was the submission of the Levant. Year after year, Thutmose returned to campaign, until the lands of Syria, Canaan, and Nubia lay beneath Egypt's sway. Tribute flowed into Thebes, gold, silver, cedar wood, lapis lazuli, cattle, and captives, swelling Egypt's wealth until the temples overflowed with offerings. No longer was Egypt a land enclosed by desert. It had become an empire, its influence stretching from the cataracts of Nubia to the rivers of Mesopotamia. And yet, Thutmose was not only a warrior. He was a builder, too. At Karnak, he added halls and obelisks, raising monuments in honor of Ammonius, the god to whom he gave thanks for his victories. His name was carved into stone not only in triumph but in devotion, linking his conquests to the eternal balance of Ma'at. Imagine his return to Thebes after a campaign. The streets fill with people singing, drums echoing, incense smoke thick in the air. Soldiers march in procession, carrying banners and treasures from foreign lands. Priests await at Karnak, ready to offer sacrifices to Ammonius in gratitude for victory. And at the center of it all rides the pharaoh, his chariot gleaming, his brow crowned with gold, his gaze steady and proud. Thutmose III had transformed Egypt. He had stretched its reach farther than any before, carving an empire from sand and stone, field and mountain. Where Hatshepsut's reign had been peace and vision, his was fire and expansion. Two halves of Egypt's greatness, bound forever together. In the wake of Thutmose's victories, the land of Egypt stood not only united, but exalted. The coffers of Thebes overflowed with tribute, the temples groaned beneath offerings, and the name of Egypt carried weight from the cataracts of Nubia to the mountains of Syria. Into this season of prosperity stepped Amenhotep II and his successors, kings who ruled less with the sword than with the glow of inherited greatness. Their reigns were marked by stability. With borders secure, Egypt's energies flowed inward, into temples, into art, into the refinement of ritual. At Karnak, new halls rose, pylons towered, and obelisks gleamed in the sun. The god Ammonius, once a modest deity of Thebes, now stood supreme, his cult vast, his priests powerful. He was the hidden one, the breath within all things, the silent strength behind the pharaoh's throne. The wealth of empire gilded daily life. Nobles reclined in villas shaded by sycamores, their gardens filled with pools of lotus and papyrus. Musicians played harps and flutes at feasts, while servants carried trays of figs, pomegranates, and roasted goose. Perfumes of myrrh and lotus oil scented the air. Artisans, freed from the demands of war, turned their hands to delicate jewelry, painted tombs, and finely carved statues. In literature, too, the age gleamed. Hymns to Ammonius filled papyrus scrolls, their words rising in praise of the god who was everywhere yet unseen. One text declared, "You are the hidden one, Lord of silence, who comes forth from the horizon, who gives breath to all who live." These were not only prayers but poetry, the flowering of Egypt's soul in language. For the common people, the prosperity of the age brought new hope. Fields along the Nile grew heavy with grain, trade flourished, and festivals multiplied. The Opet festival, in which Ammonius' image was carried from Karnak to Luxor, became the heartbeat of Thebes, a time when gods and people mingled, when the divine presence was felt in music, laughter, and incense rising beneath the blazing sun. Imagine such a festival at its height. The Avenue of Sphinxes is crowded with throngs of worshippers. Musicians shake sistrums and beat drums. Dancers whirl with garlands of lotus. Children run laughing through the crowd. Priests carry the golden bark of Ammonius upon their shoulders, its form hidden by curtains, its presence felt in the hush that falls as it passes. And as the bark enters Luxor, the people lift their voices in a single cry, praising the god who gave them life, order, and light. Thus, the age of Amenhotep and his successors was not an age of conquest, but of radiance. Egypt shone as never before, a land secure, prosperous, and devoted, its people wrapped in the golden light of Ammonius' favor. Amid Egypt's golden age, when temples to Ammonius gleamed and offerings overflowed, there arose a pharaoh unlike any before him. Akhenaten, born Amenhotep, who turned his face not to the hidden god of Thebes, but to the visible disk of the sun, the Aten. In his vision, the Aten was not one god among many, but the sole source of life. Its rays stretched down from the sky, ending in hands that offered breath and blessing. To Akhenaten, this was truth revealed, the light of the sun as the only divinity, the eternal giver of warmth, growth, and life. At first, his devotion seemed but an eccentricity. Pharaohs had long favored certain gods, but Akhenaten's passion grew, and soon he decreed what none had dared before, that Ammonius and the other gods were to be set aside, their names erased from temples, their images defaced. Only the Aten would be worshipped, radiant and singular, its altar the sky itself. He built a new city to honor his vision, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, upon a stretch of desert where cliffs embraced the Nile. Its temples were open to the sun, roofless so that light itself might flood the altars. Its streets were broad, its palaces painted with gardens and birds, its walls inscribed not with scenes of hidden rituals but with the king and his family bathed in the Aten's rays. But this dream was fragile. The priests of Ammonius, once powerful, grew restless as their wealth and influence waned. The people, accustomed to many gods close to their homes and lives, struggled with the abstraction of a distant sun. The old rhythms of worship, the festivals, the hymns, the images of gods who walked with men, felt muted, thinned beneath the glare of Aten's light. Yet Akhenaten pressed on. He and his queen, the radiant Nefertiti, appeared endlessly in reliefs, their faces lifted to the sun disk, their children playing beneath its rays. For the king, this was not only politics but revelation, a dream of purity, of devotion to the visible giver of life. Imagine walking through Akedaton at dawn. The sun rises over the cliffs, flooding the city in golden fire. Priests lift their arms, chanting hymns not in shadowed halls but under open sky. The rays of Aten stretch down, touching the king as he offers incense, while the people watch in awe and uncertainty. It is beauty, it is strangeness, it is a vision unlike any Egypt had seen. Yet already, in the silence beyond the hymns, the weight of tradition pressed. For though the sun shines brightly, it also sets. Akhenaten's dream burned brilliant, but it was a fragile flame, and in time, it would flicker. In the story of Akhenaten's strange reign, one figure shines with equal brilliance. His queen, Nefertiti. Her name still whispers through the ages. Her face, immortal in stone, gazes serene and unbroken, a vision of grace and mystery. She was more than consort. In reliefs carved upon the walls of Akedaton, she stands beside the king as his equal, sometimes even in the pose of a pharaoh, wearing the royal crown, striking enemies, offering sacrifices to the Aten. The rays of the sun fall upon her as upon him, their hands lifted together to receive its blessing. Nefertiti's beauty was celebrated in her own time, not only in legend. Artists of Akedaton captured her in flowing gowns, adorned with jeweled collars, her tall blue crown rising like flame above her brow. Yet her strength lay not only in beauty. She was the king's partner in devotion, his voice in the rituals of Aten, his balance in the court. In the new city, her presence was everywhere. Reliefs show her riding in chariots with Akhenaten, feasting with him, playing with their daughters beneath the Aten's rays. She was no distant queen, hidden behind veils of ceremony, but a radiant presence woven into daily life. The people, uncertain of the king's vision, may well have looked to her as a bridge between the strange new faith and the warmth of human grace. Legends tell of her influence in governance as well. Some inscriptions hint that she acted with near-royal authority, and some whisper that after Akhenaten's death, she may even have ruled in her own right, as pharaoh in all but name. And yet, like the Aten itself, her presence fades into mystery. Her end is uncertain. Some believe she died before Akhenaten, her absence a shadow upon his final years. Others claim she lived on, perhaps even taking another name, guiding Egypt through the chaos that followed. What endures is her image, the bust found in the sands of Akedaton, her features carved with unmatched tenderness. High cheekbones, long neck, serene eyes. Not merely the likeness of a woman, but the eternal embodiment of elegance and strength. Imagine her walking through the courtyards of her city at sunset. The Aten's rays stretch long across the stone. She pauses, her daughters laughing at her side, their hands full of lotus blossoms. She raises her eyes to the sun, her crown glowing in the fire of evening. And for a moment, the city, the faith, the very dream of Akhenaten seems to rest upon her shoulders. Nefertiti's radiance was not only her beauty, but her role as light within light, the queen who gave warmth to a vision too stark to endure alone. Tutankhamun was but a child when he became pharaoh, scarcely more than 9 years old. He was born into the turmoil of Akhenaten's reign, raised amid the light of the Aten. Yet when he came to power, the pendulum of faith swung back toward the old gods. The court around him, generals, priests, and advisors, guided his steps. They restored the worship of Ammonius, reopened temples long closed, and returned Egypt to the order it had known for centuries. The boy king, fragile in body and uncertain in health, became a symbol of renewal. His name was changed from Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. In that change lay the restoration of the land's ancient soul. His reign was short, no more than a decade. He was frail, perhaps ill from birth, and his youth left him little time to carve great monuments or win vast conquests. And yet, his death would bring him immortality. For when he passed into the silence of the tomb, his resting place was hidden away in the Valley of the Kings, a modest chamber compared to the grand mausoleums of other pharaohs, but one overlooked by thieves for centuries. There, beneath layers of desert dust, his treasures slept undisturbed. In that tomb lay wonders beyond imagination. A golden mask, radiant and serene, framed his face in eternity. Chests filled with jewels, inlaid furniture, chariots, statues of gods and guardians, vessels of alabaster, and countless offerings surrounded his mummy. Each object whispered of Egypt's artistry, devotion, and belief in eternity. When the tomb was rediscovered in modern times, the world was transfixed. The treasures shone with the brilliance of an age thought long buried, and the boy king became more famous in death than he had ever been in life. His mask, with its gentle eyes and lapis inlay, became the face of Egypt itself, gazing across time with eternal calm. Imagine his burial night in ancient Thebes. Priests move slowly through the valley, their torches flickering against the cliff walls. They chant hymns as they place his sarcophagus within the chamber, surrounding him with offerings meant to guide him into the afterlife. The tomb is sealed, silence falls, and the desert covers him with its cloak of sand. For over 3,000 years he sleeps, undisturbed, until the world remembers him again. Tutankhamun's reign was short, his deeds few, but his tomb became his true voice. Through it, the boy who once seemed fragile stands eternal, a reminder that even the briefest flame may cast a light that endures forever. Among the long line of Egypt's rulers, few names shine as brightly or endure as strongly as Ramses II, remembered simply as Ramses the Great. His reign stretched for more than 6 decades, a span so vast that generations were born and grew old beneath his rule. To his people, it seemed he was eternal, a living god upon the throne. Ramses was a builder beyond compare. His monuments rose across the two lands, from the delta in the north to the Nubian cliffs in the south. At Thebes, he raised the Great Ramesseum, a temple of colossal statues and soaring halls. At Abu Simbel, far in the south, he carved his image in stone so immense that even the desert seemed small beside it. For seated figures of the king, each towering higher than a house, their faces serene and unyielding, gazing out across the Nile for eternity. Yet Ramses was not only a builder, but a warrior. His most famous battle was fought at Kadesh, against the Hittites, a rival power of the north. There, amid dust and chariots, he claimed victory, though the truth was less clear. A struggle fierce and uncertain, remembered in inscriptions that praised his courage even as peace was later sought. The Egyptians carved scenes of him driving his chariot into enemy ranks, bow drawn, arrows flying swift as falcons. Whether triumph or stalemate, the story became legend, the king himself the embodiment of valor. Ramses filled Egypt with his image. Statues of him, vast and numerous, gazed from temple courtyards and city gates. Inscriptions spoke of his power, his devotion to the gods, his endless victories. He was remembered as the very model of kingship, the pharaoh against whom all others would be measured. Yet his reign was also one of peace, secured after treaties with the Hittites. Egypt flourished under his long stability. Trade routes thrived, granaries swelled, temples rang with hymns. He fathered many children, his lineage vast, his household a kingdom in itself. Imagine standing before Abu Simbel at dawn. The cliffs glow with the first light, and the statues of Ramses sit in perfect stillness, their faces calm, their gaze eternal. Priests chant within the temple, where shafts of sunlight pierce deep into the inner sanctuary on chosen days of the year, striking the seated figures of the gods, and the image of Ramses himself, enthroned among them. In that moment, stone and sun conspire to declare him divine. Ramses' greatness was carved not only in war, but in stone, in story, in the very memory of his people. To them, he was not merely a man, but the pharaoh eternal, the golden pinnacle of Egypt's glory. Far from Thebes, beyond the cataracts where Nubia meets the sands, Ramses ordered the carving of a temple not merely of stone, but of eternity. Abu Simbel rose from the cliffside, its facade crowned with 4 colossal statues of the king himself, each seated, each serene, each towering higher than the palm trees that line the river. Their faces, carved with calm strength, gaze across the Nile as though watching forever over Egypt's southern frontier. Time has worn their features, yet their majesty endures. To stand beneath them is to feel oneself small as an ant, while above looms the presence of Pharaoh, unshaken by sand or sky. Beyond this facade, a corridor leads inward, its walls carved with scenes of Ramses' triumphs, the Battle of Kadesh, the offerings to Ammonius, the rituals of eternal kingship. Torches once flickered upon these carvings, their shadows dancing like living echoes of war and worship. Deep within, the sanctuary holds statues of the gods seated together: Ta, Horikti, Ammonius, and Ramses himself among them, enthroned as a divine equal. Twice each year, in a wonder of design, the rising sun strikes through the temple's doorway, its beams traveling down the long hall to illuminate the faces of the gods. All but Ta, the hidden one, who remains in shadow. In this, stone and sun conspired to grant Ramses his place among the eternal. But Abu Simbel was not only for the gods. It was a message. To Nubia, it declared Egypt's power. To travelers upon the Nile, it proclaimed the might of Ramses. Even the desert seemed to bow before its scale, as though acknowledging a king who had etched his name into the bones of the earth. Imagine the festival day when the sunlight pierced the sanctuary. Priests chant in low voices, their hands raised in reverence. The air is thick with incense, the scent of myrrh and frankincense curling upward. Outside, crowds gather by the riverbank, gazing at the colossal statues as the first golden ray creeps over the horizon. Slowly, the light stretches into the temple, traveling deeper and deeper, until at last it touches the faces within. And the people erupt in cries of wonder, convinced that the gods themselves had bowed to Ramses. Abu Simbel remains, carved in silence, enduring even when kingdoms fall. The river has shifted, the sands have drifted, yet the temple stands, its colossal guardians watching still. In their stillness, they remind us of Egypt's dream of eternity, a dream carved in stone, lit by the sun, and carried forward into forever. In the north, beyond the mountains of Syria and the rivers of Anatolia, dwelled a rival power as mighty as Egypt, the Hittites. For generations, their chariots had clashed with Egypt's, their kings locked in rivalry with the Pharaohs. The most famous of these struggles was the Battle of Kadesh, where Ramses' chariots thundered across the plain. Though the Egyptians claimed victory in stone, the truth was less certain. Both sides bloodied, neither truly broken. Yet wars are costly, and kingdoms grow weary of endless struggle. In the years that followed, envoys crossed the desert with gifts and messages, their words written upon clay tablets and rolls of papyrus. Slowly, suspicion gave way to pragmatism, and pragmatism to respect. What war could not achieve, peace began to shape. At last, a treaty was sworn, the earliest recorded peace accord in human memory. Its words, carved in hieroglyphs and in the Hittite tongue alike, pledged friendship and alliance. It declared that neither kingdom would lift a sword against the other, that they would stand together against common enemies, that fugitives would be returned in honor, not harmed. The oath was sealed before the gods of both lands, their names invoked as eternal witnesses. To strengthen the bond, Ramses took a Hittite princess as wife, welcoming her into his vast household of queens and children. The union of blood and treaty wove together two powers once at odds, binding them in harmony. This peace endured. For the remainder of Ramses' reign, Egypt's northern borders stood calm, its armies no longer drawn into endless campaigns. Trade flowed freely, gifts exchanged, letters carried between courts in language both formal and warm. The rivalry that had once threatened to consume both kingdoms softened into alliance. Imagine the signing of that treaty. Scribes sit cross-legged upon the ground, their brushes wet with ink, carefully inscribing each promise upon papyrus. Envoys of the Hittites bow before Ramses, presenting the sealed tablet of their king. Priests raise their hands to the heavens, calling upon Ra and upon the storm god of the Hittites to bear witness. A hush lingers, broken only by the rustle of linen and the faint crackle of incense upon the brazier. In that moment, the weight of centuries of war is lifted. replaced by the fragile but luminous promise of peace. Thus Egypt and the Hittites, once foes upon the battlefield, became partners in diplomacy. It was not conquest that secured this triumph, but wisdom, the recognition that peace, too, can carve eternity. The reign of Ramses stretched like a river in flood, long, unbroken, nourishing. In those decades, Egypt stood at her zenith, her highest crest of glory. From the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Syria, from the gold fields of Nubia to the delta's green marshes, the pharaoh's power was known and respected. The cities bustled with wealth. Thebes rang with the chants of priests at Karnak, incense clouds curling upward in golden haze. Memphis, ancient and enduring, thrummed with trade and artisanship. In the delta, new cities grew under Ramses' hand, including Pyramus, his royal seat, vast with palaces, temples, and stables for chariots that numbered in the thousands. The land flourished. Farmers harvested barley and emmer wheat in abundance. The Nile's floods steady and kind. Nobles reclined in shaded gardens, pools brimming with lotus, while musicians strummed harps and flutes in gentle cadence. Traders returned from distant lands bearing cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, lapis from Afghanistan, and ivory from Nubia. Egypt's wealth was not only material, but cultural. For her art, her writing, her architecture reached heights of refinement unmatched. Temples swelled with offerings. At Abu Simbel, the gods received incense beneath the towering gaze of Ramses' statues. At Karnak, priests moved like shadows among towering columns, their chants filling the hypostyle hall with a sound like the pulse of the cosmos. At Luxor, festivals drew throngs into the streets, music and laughter mingling with sacred procession. The gods seemed near at hand, their presence alive in every feast, every sacrifice, every moment of life. For the common people, too, the age brought comfort. Bread was plentiful, beer flowed freely, and festivals gave respite from labor. Craftsmen found work in temples and tombs, scribes in palaces and courts. Even those who toiled in the fields might lift their eyes at sunset and see monuments rising upon the horizon, believing that Egypt's greatness was shared, in some measure, by all who lived beneath her sky. Imagine Pyramus at its height, streets crowded with merchants, their stalls heavy with spices and cloth. Chariots rattle across wide avenues, the bronze fittings of their harnesses glinting in the sun. Palaces rise, white-walled and gleaming, their courtyards shaded by palms. At evening, the royal household gathers, queens adorned with gold and carnelian, children laughing, courtiers bowing low. The air is rich with perfume and roasted meats, the sound of harps drifting through the dusk. In this moment, Egypt seemed eternal, her power unshakable, her glory boundless. She had reached her zenith, a light blazing across the ancient world. And yet, as every watcher of time knows, no sun burns forever at its height. Beyond the brilliance of Ramses' reign, shadows were already gathering at the edges of the horizon. Even as Egypt stood at her zenith, signs of strain began to show, subtle at first, like hairline fractures in polished granite. The reign of Ramses was long, and with each passing year, the burden of sustaining such grandeur grew heavier. The temples, vast and many, demanded endless offerings. The priests of Ammonius grew powerful, their wealth rivaling even the throne. Grain and gold poured into sanctuaries, feeding rituals and processions, yet draining the treasury. Where once the pharaoh's word was absolute, now it was balanced, and sometimes challenged by the quiet might of the priesthood. The empire itself was wide, perhaps too wide. Lands in Syria and Canaan, won by chariot and spear, required constant vigilance. Garrisons had to be fed, envoys bribed, rivals appeased. In Nubia, wealth still flowed, but with it came tension, for Egypt's grip, though strong, was not without resistance. The further Egypt stretched, the more fragile her hold became. Population grew, pressing upon the resources of the Nile. Though the river's floods remained faithful, they could not always match the demands of so many mouths. Famine was rare, yet whispers of hunger began to rise in certain years. Laborers, once proud to serve on temple works, sometimes grew restless beneath their burden. And in the wider world, new powers stirred. The Hittites remained, now allies, but beyond them the stirrings of Assyria, the movements of sea peoples across distant coasts, began to ripple the calm waters of Egypt's supremacy. What had once seemed eternal began to feel less secure, though none yet dared to speak it aloud. Imagine Thebes at twilight during this time. The streets still glow with torchlight, priests still chant within Karnak. The Nile still flows with golden shimmer, but in the quieter corners, merchants whisper of taxes too heavy, of debts owed to temples, of soldiers stretched thin across far lands. A farmer looks at his field, his grain too meager to fill both his family's bellies and the granary demanded by the state. The cracks are faint, yet the watcher sees them. Egypt still stood tall, still radiant, still a beacon of order. But within her heart, the seeds of decline had been sown, not yet sprouting, but waiting, as all things wait, for their season. In the late days of empire, when Ramses the Great had passed into eternity and his descendants ruled in his shadow, Egypt faced a storm unlike any before. It did not rise from Nubia, nor from the deserts, nor from rival kings of Syria. It came from the sea, carried on ships carved of foreign wood, filled with men whose tongues were unknown and whose hunger was endless. The sea peoples, so the Egyptians named them, were not one nation but many, a tide of tribes uprooted from their homelands, wandering in search of fertile ground, of conquest, of survival. They struck across the Mediterranean like a tempest, toppling kingdoms, burning cities, leaving ash where once stood palaces. The Hittite Empire crumbled before them. Other lands fell into silence. And then, their sails turned southward, toward Egypt. Pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties prepared their defenses. The Nile Delta became a shield of fortresses. Fleets gathered, archers stood ready upon the banks. When the sea peoples came, their ships crowding the horizon like a forest of masts, Egypt met them with fire and arrow. Reliefs carved at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, show the battle. Ships colliding, warriors falling into the water, Egyptian archers loosing their arrows in deadly rain. It was a desperate struggle, but Egypt prevailed. The invaders were repelled, some captured, some scattered, some settled into Egypt's borders as laborers or mercenaries. The two lands stood firm, but the victory was costly, and it carried a warning. The world beyond Egypt's deserts was changing. Powers that had once stood as neighbors or rivals had collapsed, leaving chaos in their wake. Egypt, though still strong, was no longer surrounded by familiar kingdoms, but by shifting sands of instability. Imagine the Nile Delta in those days. The reeds tremble in the wind, the horizon filled with the strange silhouettes of ships, the clash of oars, the crash of wood against wood, the shouts of men in unknown tongues fill the air. Then the hiss of arrows, the blaze of fire upon the water, the cries as foreign warriors are cast into the river. The Egyptians chant to their gods, calling for protection, their hearts steady even as the storm rages. When the battle ends, the Nile flows red in patches, yet the land remains their own. The coming of the sea peoples marked the end of an age. Egypt had survived, but the cost was weighty, and the world she knew was gone. The watchful balance of Maat, though preserved, trembled as never before. In the centuries after Ramses the Great, Egypt endured, but her light dimmed, as a flame sheltered from wind yet growing low. The pharaohs who followed bore his name, his titles, his crown, yet not his strength. They clung to his memory as one clings to the warmth of an ember after the fire has passed. Their reigns were shorter, their achievements more modest, their voices faint beside the thunder of their ancestor. The temples still stood in majesty. Columns towered like petrified forests, their painted reliefs glowing faintly with hues of red and blue. Priests still offered incense, their chants curling upward in the heavy air. Festivals were held with music and dancing. The people still bowed before the gods. Yet beneath the ceremony, something was different, less vibrant, less certain. What had once been a living flame of faith and power was now a careful repetition of forms, preserved but hollowing. The priesthood of Ammonius swelled in power. Their estates stretched wide, their wealth rivaling the throne itself. Gold that once filled the coffers of the crown now streamed into temple treasuries. Pharaohs, once mediators of gods and men, now seemed dependent upon priests to hold Ma'at in balance. At times it felt as though Egypt was ruled not from the palace, but from the sanctuaries of Karnak and Luxor. Beyond the borders, Egypt's reach contracted. Syria and Canaan slipped from her grasp, their tributes silenced, their cities claimed by foreign powers. Nubia, long a wellspring of gold, wavered in its loyalty. The bond between kingdoms stretched thin. The great trade networks that had carried cedar from Lebanon and lapis from Afghanistan weakened. Egypt, long accustomed to abundance, began to taste the bitterness of scarcity. Within the land, the cracks deepened. Even the loyal workers of Deir el-Medina, who for generations carved and painted the tombs of kings, laid down their tools in protest when their wages of grain went unpaid. Their strike, the first recorded in history, whispered of a kingdom struggling to provide for its own. Famine haunted certain years, not with total ruin but with gnawing unease, as though the Nile itself had grown weary of sustaining empire. And beyond the desert's edge, the world shifted restlessly. The sea peoples had come and gone, leaving echoes of chaos. New rivals, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, gathered strength, casting long shadows toward the Nile. Egypt, once the radiant center of the world, now stood as one among many, her voice no longer commanding all ears. Imagine Thebes in this twilight. The columns of Karnak rise still, massive and unmoving, but their paint flakes, their inscriptions wear. Priests shuffle through the hypostyle hall, their chants echoing in near-empty silence. Merchants sit in the marketplace with weary eyes, their wares fewer, their coins scarce. Farmers, once proud of their harvests, mutter that the granaries take too much and return too little. Children play along the riverbanks, but their laughter rings thinner, less secure. And yet, through this waning, the monuments remained, serene and eternal. The pyramids still pierced the sky, the temples still stretched toward the heavens, the statues of kings still gazed with unblinking calm across the desert sands. Egypt faded, but she faded as the sun fades, in slow beauty, in a long cascade of crimson and gold. For though power waned, memory endured. The priests still whispered the names of gods. The scribes still copied the ancient tales. The Nile still flowed, steady as breath, carrying boats between villages that had stood for centuries. Egypt did not vanish. She transformed, entering the long twilight of remembrance, where her true eternity was found. Like a star burning out, her light was not extinguished but spread across the heavens of memory. Other empires would rise, conquer, claim, and vanish. But Egypt, even in decline, remained eternal in her stones, her words, her silence. Thus the Watcher saw her twilight, not as a fall into nothingness, but as a gentle fading into legend, where the breath of gods lingered in stone, and the murmur of the Nile carried her story ever onward. I have watched kingdoms rise like the morning sun, and fall like twilight upon the desert cliffs. None glowed so long, so brilliantly, as Egypt. From the first farmers who knelt by the river, shaping mud into vessels and prayers into song, to the pharaohs who raised pyramids like stairways to the heavens, to the temples that still stand, their columns reaching like stone forests toward eternity. Egypt was a dream written upon the earth itself. She was born of the Nile, fed by its floods, guarded by its deserts. She sang of gods whose faces were falcons and lions, who breathed in incense and in the hearts of kings. She carved her memories into granite and sandstone, so that even when her voices faded, her silence would still speak. I have walked among her triumphs, the golden vision of Hatshepsut, the empire of Thutmose, the radiance of Amenhotep, the strange, burning dream of Akhenaten, the serene beauty of Nefertiti, the fragile flame of Tutankhamun, the thunderous reign of Ramses the Great. And I have lingered through her twilight, when shadows grew long and her strength waned, yet her monuments endured, gazing still across the sands. Empires are mortal as men are mortal, but Egypt sought eternity, and in a way she found it, not in endless power, but in memory, in stone, in the whisper of the Nile beneath a crescent moon. Even now, when the desert wind stirs, it carries the breath of priests chanting in Karnak, the laughter of children along the riverbank, the chisel strike of artisans carving a king's eternal face. And so I leave her here, in her silence, in her glory, in her twilight. Egypt has fallen, and yet she endures. For to remember her is to walk again among her temples, to hear the rustle of papyrus, to feel the warmth of her sun. And if this journey has eased your waking hours, if her story has carried you gently into rest, then I welcome you to return to me, when night again spreads its quiet veil, and we may walk once more through the forgotten paths of time.